everybody, welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Donald as usual. And today we have a special guest with us. My friend Ibrahim will be talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, especially the current conflicts and the intervention of the West into those two countries, and maybe a little bit about the 20th century history, something along those lines. So we're recording this on Saturday. There's been big news for Afghanistan today. Trump and the Taliban signed a peace agreement, and it looks like they may be winding down the war after 18 years. I haven't looked too much into the specifics of it, but I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic about things over there right now. How about you guys?
Yeah, so I think cautiously optimistic is like like a sensible reaction to that because there's no real guarantee that it's going to hold. It allows for I think it's a 1 year or 14-month transition until the U.S. withdrawal,
Right.
and then after that the agreement is, I think it's like deliberately vague on what's going to happen after that. The main U.S. interest is that the Taliban doesn't support like Al Qaeda or these sorts of groups, or let them operate from Afghanistan the way that happened in 2001. But apart from that, I think it's purposely it has some omissions just because they couldn't agree on this. Like the Taliban insisted on cutting out the Afghan government, which was set up by the U.S. So that's not really a party to this conflict, and they themselves have incentive sort of to play spoiler
Hmm.
because they are not in favor of the U.S. going. And then the other spoiler is like these extreme, like I don't want to exaggerate their number, but there's like a few hundred, few thousand, I'm not exactly sure, extreme sorts of groups. And then I don't think the hardliner and moderate view on this, which a lot of people tend to view this through, I don't think that's that relevant because the main recruiting line that the Taliban have had for a long time, and different factions in the group have been generally united on this, is that they wanted the US to get out. I'm sure that they would want to take over themselves the way they did in the 1990s, but at the same time, they've had a lot of trouble in trying to get recognition, first of all. And then second of all, they have had a lot more trouble in the battlefield compared to the situation in the 1990s
Right.
for obvious
Yeah.
reasons. Not the Afghan government has air power. It has a lot of allies. So that is kind of a deterrent for them to push for total victory. So that's another factor that has to be considered. And the other factor is that the Afghan government itself is very much split. It was always a coalition of different groups that were basically held together by a common interest, which was opposition to the Taliban. But apart from that, there are conflicting group of interests that is in the government. And actually, even now, the two leaders of the government have separate administrations running. So Ashraf Ghani, who is the officially recognized ruler of Afghanistan, he officially won the last two elections. They were both contested. His government is now facing a challenge from Abdullah, he's officially the CEO of Afghanistan, but he's basically the number two man in the government, and he's running a separate government. He's announced his own governors and stuff, and this all happened in the last few weeks. So there is a lot of conflict between these two factions as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the 90s. I think it's a very different situation. I haven't been paying super close attention to it, but I'm pretty familiar with the 90s war in Afghanistan, and
Mhm.
it doesn't seem like a similar situation at all. I don't think that the Taliban have anything close to the ability to like take over that the
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the 90s, to a large extent, a lot of their conquests were done by basically taking advantage of like infighting between their rivals.
right.
So that sort of thing is still relevant now. It depends on how well the Afghan pro-government factions hold together. But the other factor is that they were able to mediate much more effectively, like with different groups that were like pick out differences between different groups and get the cooperation of one group in a region and then take over that region and so on and so forth. I'm not sure that is going to be as easy now.
Right. I guess one thing that might be useful for people is to sort of outline. I don't know how much of this you know, but to whatever extent you do know about this, like how coherent is the Taliban, and what exactly does it look like at this point? Because it's gone through so many different like evolutions and changes that it's a little bit unclear exactly what
Yeah,
it
so
is at this point.
there was actually a lot of like like scholarly controversy and stuff over this, because at one point a lot of people were saying that it's just like a label and different groups take the label but are not really united. But
Right, yeah.
I have always thought that that was a very that there isn't much substance to that, because the Taliban generally, whatever else has happened to the group when they were in power, when they were kicked out of power, they have generally placed a lot of emphasis on internal discipline. To the like this was probably the major factor that set them apart from other groups.
Hmm.
So they have had their they have had problems with, like, let's say, an autonomous group or a group that broke away. This especially happened around 4 or 5 years ago, when there was like a full mutiny inside the Taliban. But for the most part, they are, in most parts of the country, they are pretty much unified, in the sense that if someone sitting in Quetta or wherever their headquarters is, or in Peshawar or wherever, or in Helmand or southern Afghanistan, if they give an order to someone in northern Afghanistan, generally that is going to be followed out. And just one example of that recently is that before this deal, they announced a week ceasefire, and it held up. And this is the latest of several times that this has happened. So in that sense, they are a pretty disciplined group. They have had a lot of differences, in the sense that a lot of their commanders have occasionally competed over the same role, or over command of this region, or of this office or whatever. But that has rarely affected the group, as like the cohesion of the group as a whole. It's more of a competition for a post. Now, the main exception to this came in 2015, when there was what I called a mutiny in the Taliban, and that was basically after it was discovered that the Taliban founder Mullah Omar Mujahid, he had basically been dead for 2 years, and his deputies, who were not on good terms with each other anyway, one of them, Akhtar Muhammad Mansour, he took over power, and he kind of rigged an election, or gerrymandered an election, or whatever, to get himself voted in as the next Amir.
Hmm.
So he had he had two types of opposition to him. One was a lot of his old colleagues in the Taliban, veterans, like the guys who mostly from southern Afghanistan, who had been there for since the 90s, and they thought he was underhanded, or they thought he was, like, overambitious, or manipulative, or whatever. They wanted Omar's son or his brother to take over instead, but Akhtar Mansour managed to get both of them to endorse him, in the interest of the greater good, or whatever. So this group of dissidents, they didn't like fight against the Taliban. They either quit, or a lot of them had been sidelined anyway, so it didn't really make much difference, or they fell in line. The other mutiny, it was led by another one of the senior Taliban. His name is Rasul Mujahid. He had a lot of influence in Western Afghanistan, and this is a region that has always had a lot of autonomous sorts of groups, for a lot of reasons. One reason is that it's far from Pakistan, which is, like, the main foreign center for insurgents. And another reason is that there have always been a lot of different, like, warlords in different fronts in Western Afghanistan. So in this region, the Taliban had a lot of what I would call, like, vassals, as opposed to actual members of the Taliban. So just people who they kind of hired based on shared interests. Some of these were militias who had worked for the government before, and a lot of them belonged to the tribe of Rasul Mujahid, and they mutinied against Akhtar Muhammad Mansour. And there were like two or three battles, but when Akhtar Muhammad Mansour, he actually got the help of Iran, which had until then been a big opponent of the Taliban. So he got their help to basically cut off these groups from Iranian support, and to get Iranian weapons and supplies and whatever. So he himself was actually killed right after that. He was killed by a U.S. airstrike. But when he was killed, that his successor was also from the Nurzai tribe, and he was kind of like a compromise figure. He's still in charge. His name is Hibatullah Akhundzada. So when he came to power, a lot of these groups basically, they switched back, and there's only a few of them left. They're still there, but they're not a particular challenge, and some of them have actually been co-opted by the government again. So I guess what I'm saying basically is that, generally speaking, the Taliban have been more or less a cohesive organization, even if there's, like, power struggles inside it. On the main policy issues, they're more or less united.
Right. It's difficult for us to make sense of it, I guess. just because it doesn't look anything like a Western political movement. Like
Mhm.
it doesn't really look the same way that we expect things to look. It's kind of more fragmented in the sense that it's got these various groups that form a cohesive whole, but you have to pay attention to how much these groups are willing to work together and to maintain like a unified command structure, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and in this sense, like the main advantage that the Taliban have over most other groups is that basically the Taliban with a lowercase t have been like it's been a social religious network in Afghanistan and in parts of Pakistan for like a long time for probably like decades or centuries. Networks of like religious teachers and their students, mostly rural. They know each other, they have similar background. It's kind of like almost a social subclass in itself.
Mhm.
So in that sense, they have the advantage that they can build on these networks of talibs and teachers and stuff like that to a greater extent than other groups. Because most of the formal insurgency groups in the war against the Soviet Union, they were based off parties or like like networks of certain commanders. It's much easier to break through something like that or to infiltrate compared to these very old social, religious, political, whatever.
Yeah, I think that might be why that fell apart in the 90s is because I mean, famously, Hekmatyar like went against he didn't accept the position in the government, and that kind of just caused everything to fall apart. So it was just barely hanging on by the fact that everyone was willing to work together. But as soon as he broke away, it kind of all fell apart there.
Yeah, even before, like that was probably the most dramatic case. But even before he broke away, there was a lot of infighting between the different Mujahideen groups. There was infighting in the Afghan communist government as well.
Right.
They were both very fragmented in the 1980s. And in fact, the counterinsurgency that the Afghan government tried, which to an extent the US has also tried this, like at least when Petraeus and McChrystal and these guys were there, which was basically to set up militias. So that helped fragment it more because a lot of these militias were basically mercenaries, and they switched sides a lot. And the best example of that is Abdur Rashid Dostum, he's probably the most powerful commander in northern Afghanistan, and he was the vice president of Afghanistan too for Ashraf Ghani. And he was a guy who was he basically started out as a worker in northern Afghanistan. He joined the one of the communist parties, the Parcham Party, and they and the Soviets basically they armed him and gave and paid him and stuff. And he built up a big militia, and he was used a lot like storming Mujahideen positions and stuff in the 1980s. Then at the start of the 1990s, he basically switched sides after the Afghan ruler, who's Najibullah at that time. He tried to sideline him basically, so he switched sides and he helped oust Najibullah. But he was basically like like a classic mercenary type, and he's so these sorts of things were still happening before 1992 even. But in 1992, when Hikmatyar basically refused to join the coalition and he attacked Kabul, that sort of shattered any sort of coherence beyond repair. But it was a process that had been like a long time coming because both the pro-communist and the anti-communist sides in Afghanistan had been fragmented for a long time. So you had cases where you had a pro-communist militia fighting alongside Mujahideen militia against another faction of the communists and who were allied with another faction of the Mujahideen. So this thing happened quite commonly in the late 1980s, and then in the 1990s it kind of spiraled out of control.
Yeah. So just a few things come to mind there. I guess just to kind of explain it very simply, the communist side at that period, it was basically two sides to it. There was a more pro Afghanistan communism, and then there was like a pro Soviet communist faction, and they were not at odds, or they were at odds with each other, right? They
Yeah,
were not happy with each other.
yeah. I wouldn't say it was pro-Afghanistan versus pro-Soviet that much because there were basically two parties of the communists who took power in 1978
Yeah.
and then 1979. And so one of them was the Khalq, which was mainly rural Pashtuns.
Hmm.
Pashtuns are the I think the single biggest ethnic group in Afghanistan. These were mainly rural Pashtuns. They were often very dismissive towards other ethnic groups, and they were very hardline in their tactics. So, like for example, there were like stories of them going into villages and like ripping off girls like headscarves or burqas or whatever. And I guess in a sense they were like, like the classic sort of revolutionary from the countryside who wants to like basically turn the whole order upside down.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was the Parchamis, who were mostly from other ethnic groups. They tended to be urban, and they were actually quite weak at the start, and they came into power after the Soviet invasion. And the Soviet invasion, basically, they were so alarmed at the other party, at the Khalq party, which had been, it had been brutal. It had been provoking a lot of like revolt and stuff like that against it. And they also suspected that its leader Hafizullah Amin was an American agent. He wasn't, but that's what they thought. They thought he was like a. They thought he was basically going to turn. He was going to spoil the communist revolution in Afghanistan. So they invaded Afghanistan. They killed him, and then they placed the Parchami party in power. But that was more of a coalition government, and the different factions in that coalition were always squabbling amongst themselves too.
Yeah, I guess that
Yeah.
is a better way to
Yeah.
phrase it. Yeah.
The main thing that came to mind when I was reading some articles about the peace treaty sort of thing or peace agreement that was come out today was, number one, is that they emphasized very heavily, in the American press, they emphasized, Mike Pompeo being there and not actually being that happy about it. Kind of, they were trying to really frame it as a sort of fragile, potentially mistaken agreement or something that. And it was actually a bit funny because it was kind of framing it as giving up on liberalism kind of thing, right? Like giving up on women's rights and all of this kind of thing. Really focused on this idea that it was like an abandonment almost and giving up on sort of the stated goals of the coalition. And then on the other end of it, this idea that a disbelief at the idea that the Taliban would be able to enforce the sort of last ditch strategic goal of this peace agreement, which is to make it so that attacks can't be planned or organized, or they don't want groups that can project power in Afghanistan kind of thing, right? They don't want. So those are the two American frames that I saw of the agreement. The one being a sort of risk at abandonment in this almost colonial mentality of that, and then the other, the unlikelihood that the security goals will be met with the Taliban in partnership there. So. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with the first one, I think this is probably a common feature in like most wars, especially long wars like this one, where the attacking party they tell themselves, sort of like pleasant myths that they want to hear. So in this case, it was about rescuing Afghan women, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So the war was never about rescuing Afghan women, like just to put it bluntly. Yes, there have been gains for Afghan women, especially in the urban areas. But this was a very incidental like byproduct. Even in the pro-government camp, for example, you have a lot of abuses and things like that towards women. So some of the militias, for example, that are formally aligned with the government, they're not like they're not 100% under the government control, but a lot of them are like they're very notorious for their behavior towards women. With the Taliban, their thing was more of a social extremism that was more reflective, in my opinion, and I'm sure this is no comfort or whatever to people who had to go through that, but it was more of a situational sort of thing. These were people who had come from rural Afghanistan. They had come in a conflict situation where things such as rape and these sorts of things had been very common. They were not especially well educated. They were not very worldly or whatever. Like a lot of country bumpkins, they had ideas about the big city like Kabul or whatever being a hub of vice, and they were definitely as ultra conservative in that sense. But they were not out to we're gonna oppress women or we're gonna imprison women or whatever because that's just the way it should be. Their aim was not that different from what you have in Saudi Arabia or even in conservative parts of other countries, like for example rural Yemen or a lot of tribal sorts of areas where there is a lot of social, ultra conservatism. Their main thing, for example, in the field of women's education, they were not against women's education. They were against, mixed co-education, it didn't say a lot for their priorities. It was definitely stupid and it was harmful, but it wasn't the sense of, like women must never be educated because, then they will break away from, like whatever. It was definitely more of a situational thing, and there were very few, but there were women's schools or whatever under them. They were very rudimentary. They were not, they were not up to standard or whatever. But at the same time, this was a a non-state actor trying to set up a statelet. It was basically isolated from the world apart from Pakistan and to some extent Saudi Arabian funds. I think they placed too much emphasis on this, gender segregation factor, and definitely in the cities where they were actually very unpopular. And there's stories of like Afghan professional women, for example, like doctors and stuff like that, going out and like challenging Taliban governors and stuff like that over this. But these things were not a fundamental aim of the Taliban to, like, we're going to ban women's education because we don't like women or something like that. In the insurgency, and a lot of people put this down to like, being politically pragmatic, but in my opinion, from what I've seen, I just think the situation is very different from what it was in the 1990s. In the insurgency, they have around a quarter to a third of Afghanistan is under their control, and a good deal of it is like half under their control, where they rule parts of it. They haven't banned education or stuff like that. So from that perspective, I don't think the women's rights thing holds much water. I think there's a few very good books on this. There's one by Peter Marsden, which was written in 1998, and I forget what it's called, but it has a very good overview of basically daily life during the Taliban rule, including social extremism or stuff like that.
Is it the Taliban War, Religion, and the New Order in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's the one. It's from 1998. So when he said New Order, it means new in 1998.
Yeah.
So yeah. So it's a pretty good book. This guy's written quite a few books about Afghanistan, and in it, one of the points he makes is that from the Taliban's point of view, which was it was obviously kind of a self-serving point of view, but they were quote unquote liberating Afghan women from fear of rape or robbery or whatever, which was definitely exaggerated as a feature by the Taliban. Like the area of Afghanistan where they originated, it was definitely more common there than it was in a lot of other areas. But it was more of a sort of social paranoia rather than a we hate women, we can we're going to stake everything on not letting women do anything or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much dependent on the situation, and it was, to an extent, it was also exaggerated a lot after their downfall, because a lot of typical triumphalist literature came out, usually by non-Afghan authors, or in some cases by certain Afghan political factions that basically exaggerated Taliban villainy by a lot. So from my point of view, I don't think the women's rights thing holds much water, except to an extent in urban Afghanistan, because I'm not sure if they were not ever very capable rulers, and they were apart from the very basic administrative stuff, and they don't rule any city even now. So they haven't proven that they could rule a big city like Kabul or Herat with any improvement to the 1990s. But I don't think that this is a very relevant field, especially when you look at the very widespread scale of gender abuse and stuff that is taking place by militias and to some extent soldiers and police on the pro-government side. So that seems to me like making a virtue out of political necessity or whatever. The other thing was about Al-Qaeda and these sorts of people operating from Afghanistan. This is a trickier question because Al-Qaeda was never a very big group, even at its peak. I think even in their offshoots in Yemen and Syria and places like that, they've tended to ally with different tribes and stuff like that. But at the same time, the problem with Al-Qaeda is that they kind of took advantage of a lot of different militant groups in the region that tolerated them for several reasons. One reason was that they had a lot of money, especially Osama bin Laden. He's from one of the premier Saudi trading families. He was almost like a prince. He had a lot of money, and he spent it a lot as well. And in the 1990s, he was throwing out money very lavishly. So a lot of different groups, and this isn't restricted to the Taliban. This is restricted to a lot of groups, including Afghan groups that were against the Taliban. This also includes certain Pakistani groups. It includes other groups further abroad. But Al-Qaeda basically took advantage of that, and most of these groups were waging warfare. In the case of Afghanistan, it was warfare between different factions. In other places, for example, Kashmir or Tajikistan, at that time there was a war in Tajikistan. In those cases, they were waging wars against whatever government. But these were not groups that were bent on terrorist attacks in New York or places like that. they had a very clear regional or local adversary that they were fighting. And the main way that Al-Qaeda managed to embed itself was that there was a lot of chaos in this area. A lot of these groups fought each other a lot. A lot of them were like vying for power basically, or for legitimacy. And Al-Qaeda basically used its money and to an extent its ideology in order to promote itself as a kind of not a kingmaker, but kind of like a mediator between these groups. So, for example, in Pakistan, there were a lot of groups that used to fight. There was very few differences between these groups as far as ideology or background goes, but they would fight each other a lot basically over power. Mm-hmm. So, what Osama bin Laden did in the late 1990s was he came to Afghanistan, and from there he sent a lot of money into these groups in Pakistan, basically in order to get them band together or reconcile their differences. He sort of did the same thing with the Taliban too, because when the Taliban were fighting in northern Afghanistan, at that time they got a lot of volunteers, mainly for Pakistan, but also from Uzbekistan and a few other places. And a lot of these were like sort of sectarian sort of militias, and the Taliban had no control over them, or very little control over them anyway. So what Al-Qaeda did was basically, again, they gave a lot of funds to the Taliban. They basically tried to get these groups to organize into like a brigade or like a unit under the Taliban, so it would come under their control. And my personal opinion is that this is one of the main reasons that the Taliban were very reluctant to get rid of Osama bin Laden, because they had an exaggerated view of his importance to the Muslim world. They thought that he was widely respected because they had seen him mediating between XYZ militia and ABC militia. They also thought that if they handed him over, a lot of these groups were gonna turn against them. And if you read the talks of Taliban officials or diplomats or whatever with U.S. officials at that time, in the years 1998 to 2001, like you get the sense that they were definitely kind of frightened of what the repercussion is going to be on them if they handed over Osama bin Laden. So they thought that if they handed him over, they would lose control basically, and they would lose their legitimacy and stuff. But Osama bin Laden has been dead for like a decade now. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan it's not a big factor. It's definitely there, but there's a lot of competitors. There's the Daesh franchise there, which has been fighting the Taliban for a few years now, for about 5 years. And there's other smaller militias, which I think that who have generally proven to be unreliable to the Taliban. So, for example, a lot of them defected to Daesh in 2015. A lot of them very flagrantly used to undermine the Taliban, especially in eastern Afghanistan during the insurgency. So in that sense, I think that I don't think the Taliban would be as tolerant of Al-Qaeda or these sorts of groups as they were in the 1990s. But having said that, I'm not sure how capable they are of stopping these groups themselves. But I think the same could be said of a lot of different groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Like, I don't think that's limited to the Taliban. Like, for example, right now there is a big international force, basically Americans and a few others in Afghanistan. There's a government with its army with various militias, and they have not been able to root out Al-Qaeda either. So I don't think this is something that's limited to the Taliban.
Sure. Yeah.
Before we go on to the questions, there was like one thing I wanted to make sure that we cover, and that was the question of just why does Afghanistan end up being the theater for so much like international proxy conflict and stuff like that? Like, of course we see the United States being massively involved, but previous to that it was the Soviets, and before that it was the British, and there's kind of a persistent fact of Iran on one side and India and Pakistan on the other. And so why does Afghanistan matter? Like, it's not a very wealthy country. Is it strategically important, or is it a resource scramble? Like, what is all this about?
I think the main, I think you partly answered it. Or the main thing is its strategic location. Mm-hmm. In the 19th century, it was Russia and to the north, and then Britain to the south in their Great Game. And a lot of people, they tend to look at everything that happens in Afghanistan through this lens of the Great Game. In the 1980s, the Soviets, they always had an interest in Afghanistan, mainly because it was it was right on their southern border. it was the only Central Asian country that they had not, or Central Asian region that they had not conquered. They didn't actually intend to invade it at first. They just intended to install like a sort of client government there, and they kind of got drawn in despite themselves.
Right.
And then when they got drawn in, it was a very brutal war, and it was not a war that the Soviet Union had been clamoring it for a while. They kind of blundered into it. So with the United States again, the main trigger was the attacks in 2001. But the thing is that at least if you look at 20, like in the last maybe four decades in Afghanistan, I think regional competition as opposed to like superpower competition, it plays a big role as well, because obviously there were the Soviets who installed their client government in Afghanistan, but when they collapsed, there was a big vacuum not only in Afghanistan, but there was a big vacuum in former Soviet Central Asia, and this is a region that has a lot of energy, has a lot of resources. It's in between China and Russia.
Hmm.
So there were a lot of different countries. The U.S. was like, there's sort of a myth that the U.S. was very hands off towards Afghanistan in the 1990s, which is sort of true to the extent that definitely in the early 1990s it was not on their radar, but definitely by the mid 1990s they were starting to take a big interest in it. But not just the U.S. There was also Iran, there was Pakistan, there was India, there was more indirectly there was Saudi Arabia, and the thing was that Central Asia, after the Soviet collapse, most of the Central Asian republics were pretty new. They were pretty weak. In Tajikistan, there was actually a civil war in which a lot of groups participated, um, and Russia itself was not keen to see this region that it had formerly ruled go out of its control. So there was a competition between all these different countries. There was also sort of like an ideological edge to it, in the sense that in the 1980s the big rallying point basically for the war in Afghanistan had been like an Islamic jihad against communism. When that war was won, and like to the extent that it was won, a lot of people they looked at this new Central Asian, a lot of countries looked at this new Central Asian region, and they thought, okay, this is a good place to invest, or to build up links. And at that
Hmm.
time, most of these Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, and these Kazakhstan is a little further north, but this region, they were ruled by basically like former apparatchiks in the Soviet party, who had been like they had been mid-level, or in some cases senior level officials during Soviet rule, but they had very little control themselves in like once the Russian part of the Soviets left, because the Central Asia itself had very few soldiers, and like senior sort of soldiers or officials or officers or police or whatever during the Soviet period. Most of them tended to come from other parts of the Soviet Union. So most of these governments were very weak. In some cases, again, largely for strategic reasons. So, for example, there's a lot of oil or not oil. There's a lot of energy resources in Kazakhstan, and then also there's also their location, which is between Russia, China, Iran, and the subcontinent. So this area was very lucrative, and a lot of competing countries competed over it. And for most of them to get to that area, Afghanistan was a necessary place to go through it. This also, sometimes this took on an ideological edge too. So, like in Pakistan during the 1980s, they had at the 1990s, they had this idea of the liberation of Afghanistan being the springboard for the liberation of the rest of Central Asia from communist or quasi-communist sort of rule. So in the early 90s, Pakistan was very heavily involved in helping usually like Islamic sort of militant groups in this region. Iran also had this sort of thing, but Iran increasingly, and especially after the Taliban came, they started building links with a lot of these governments, particularly in Tajikistan, which were nervous about the Taliban, and the Taliban became sort of a shared enemy for Iran and also for these generally secularist sorts of governments. But until the mid 90s, Iran also had a lot of had shared this sort of idea that Pakistan did as well. Then there was India, and India and Pakistan both wanted to get, they wanted to get access to trade basically in Central Asia. There was also the conflict between them. So Pakistan, well known for the idea of strategic depth in Afghanistan, which is basically having a friendly government in Afghanistan in order to have a backup against India. India, for the same reason, had always wanted a friendly government in Afghanistan for the purpose of encircling Pakistan. And because Pakistan backed the Taliban, and the Taliban were kicked out for a long time, and they were the target of the war on terror, for a long time, people like different countries such as the US would look at the Pakistani side of this and criticize it, especially the idea of strategic depth. But it was also an Indian idea, and India pumped a lot of resources into Afghanistan after 2001, mostly into arming like different warlords and stuff, also into aid to some extent, but a lot of these were like fund for different political or military leaders. And India was also especially close to the Afghan Secret Service. And the Afghan Secret Service, to a very large extent, it's the holdover from the communist period, because during the communist period, the Secret Service usually belonged to most of them belonged to the Parchami party. And actually its founder, Najibullah, became the Parchami ruler of Afghanistan. So when Najibullah fell, most Afghan Secret Service, they defected to the side of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a Mujahideen leader. But like a lot of them, he was a Tajik, and he was also opposed to Hikmat Yar, who was very much detested by the Afghan Secret Service because he was strongly connected to the Pakistani intelligence, and also because he had allied with the Khalq party against them in the early 90s. Then from this link, it was actually the Afghan Secret Service that connected India with Ahmad Shah Massoud, who had until then been very opposed to India because India had been backing the communist government. So India basically, when the Taliban came, India kept on arming Massoud and other groups, and when the Taliban were overrun, then India obviously benefited from that. So the India-Pakistan rivalry is also very relevant here, and actually I think if a neutral observer sees reactions to what's happening in Afghanistan, they would be surprised at how invested both India and Pakistan are in what happens there. So, for example, today's peace deal has been like the whole process was very, very strongly criticized in India, and by the same token, it was very much hailed in Pakistan, or celebrated in Pakistan. So anyway, these are the different factors. Afghanistan's strategic location. To an extent, there's the sort of ideological thing of quasi-communist groups against quasi-Islamic groups, but I think a lot of this stuff was blurred in the 1990s. To an extent, I think it was relevant. And then finally, Afghanistan does have some resources. A lot of people talk about lithium, mineral resources, especially in the Northeast. And then, like cynics would also talk about opium and stuff like that. So I think it's a combination of factors, but generally, I think Afghanistan tends to suffer from its strategic location. This is like a pattern that has been repeated again and again. And because so many countries take an interest in it, it tends to play a very outsized role in regional and then also in international politics.
Right. The other thing I wanted to get into is the question of, I suppose, the narrative around the idea of Islamists and militia groups as proxies and contras for foreign powers. I just wanted to get your impression of that. That narrative it's a kind of a simplistic narrative, but it seems pretty widespread, especially on the left, and most of our listeners tend to be on the left side of the political spectrum, I would say.
Okay.
So I don't know. Do you think that there's some common misconceptions about the way that relationship works, the foreign power and local militia relationship?
Yeah, definitely in the case of Afghanistan, because when people when they refer to the Mujahideen or whatever as a U.S. proxy, it comes from a very kind of binary view of the world as it comes from the opposite end of the Cold Warrior spectrum. So whereas capitalist Cold Warriors saw every liberation movement or whatever in the world during the Cold War as an outgrowth of communism or whatever, this is sort of the flip version of that.
Right.
And the thing is that there have always been throughout the entire colonial period, and I mean European colonial period, there have always been like Islamic sorts of uprisings. Actually, when the Afghanistan war started in the late 70s or early 80s, a lot of people compared it to the revolt in what is now Uzbekistan, which had taken place by various Uzbek leaders against the early Soviets, which was in the 1920s. And again, that revolt had, it was not backed by capitalist superpowers or whatever. The one in the 1980s was, but it was funded by the US, and it was very heavily funded. In fact, I think in terms of money, it was probably the most heavily funded of all of them. But the thing is that the comparison with the Contras is a completely wrong comparison, as is the comparison of the Soviet war in Afghanistan with US proxies in other regions. Because for the Soviets, Afghanistan was their backyard. It was they treated Afghanistan in the sort of dismissive, and like I've said before, they had not been very keen to invade it in the first place. But once they invaded it, they treated it in a very, very colonial sense. And even before they invaded, they definitely wanted to have their faction in power. And the coups of the 1970s, the Soviets played a big role in those coups. And I would compare their role in Afghanistan and in this region as a whole. I would compare it to the role of the US in Latin America. Because the US and the Latin America, they were both, like after World War II, they both became superpowers. But before World War II, they were both, I don't want to say second rate, but they were both empires in the sense that, they had their area, they had their sphere of influence, and they wanted to affect that sphere of influence. So the US, of course, especially, I guess, on the left, it's very famous for backing coups or invading or, subverting various sort of liberation groups in Latin America. And the Soviets in Afghanistan, they were very subversive as well. And the Afghan insurgency, it was not a proxy of the US because it predated US support. It began actually in the mid 1970s. And the frictions or whatever that had led to it actually began even earlier than that. And at that time, the US had very little interest in Afghanistan. The US didn't actually start taking an interest in Afghanistan until the late 1970s. And at that point, Zbigniew, what's his name? Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think. Yeah, he's famous for he's famous for saying that we're going to use these whatever Muslim holy warriors like chess pawns or something like that. And people usually bring this up to show that these guys were remote controlled or like puppets of the US. But the thing is that the Afghan insurgency had gone on and off since the mid 70s. In the late 1970s, that was when this statement was made, and the US started taking an interest. But until that point, it had been Pakistan which had been helping the insurgency in Afghanistan. And Pakistan, for its own reasons, it had a lot of border tensions with Afghanistan, and Afghanistan had been backing a revolt in Pakistan as well. So it was neighbors fighting each other sort of thing. But the main insurgency that broke out after the communist takeover, it was funded by the Pakistani military dictator Ziaul Haq. And Ziaul Haq became allied to the US, yes, but early on he was actually not blacklisted, but he was actually frozen out by Carter's government because he executed his predecessor. His predecessor had also helped the Afghan revolt, so in their foreign policies they were pretty similar. And Ziaul Haq actually, because he was kind of influenced by Pakistani Islamists, to the extent that he had a ruling, to the extent that he had an ideology. He was kind of a Machiavellian character himself, but he was very sympathetic to what you would call Islamist sort of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So he was always very suspicious of the West from the very start. And in fact, the first offers of aid that Reagan's government gave him, he dismissed them and he said that this isn't enough, this is peanuts. And he played a lot on the US fears of Russian invasion or whatever, but he never let the US, including the CIA, get near the Afghan groups. I have two uncles actually who fought in that war. One of them got killed actually, but the other one he told me recently, and this is like a well-known saying, that the US influence, it ended at Islamabad.
Right.
because the Pakistani Secret Service, which is like, the ISI, which really came into its own during Ziaul Haq's period, they were very, very, and that's still the case today. They were very, very territorial in the sense that they did not want the CIA to have any contact, and the ISI itself did not have full control over the Afghan groups, because these are groups that are primarily local. They have a wide range of like allegiances and stuff. They have a wide range of. It was a very widespread revolt. It wasn't like like it wasn't a single organization or a single group of people like the Taliban are today. It was a very widespread revolt. There was even like help from China, and these sorts of. There were even sympathizers of China there, Maoists and stuff, along with like Islamic groups or tribal groups or whatever. So even the ISI was not really able to control them to the extent that it would have liked, or its main way of controlling them was basically to hand out money to the group that it preferred most. And often, like in the case of Hikmatyar was by the end of the war, he was the most favored leader of the Afghan groups in Pakistan. He was like he got a lot of money, he got a lot of weapons, and he was very close to a lot of Pakistani political and military sort of elites.
Yeah, based on my reading, from what I understand, the CIA was not really able to, or they just didn't distribute weapons and money outside of the ISI. They essentially gave it to the ISI, and then the ISI tended towards the end to just give it to Hekmatyar. So all that CIA money was going to essentially one guy.
Yeah, and the CIA were very hostile to Hikmatyar because he was
right.
Like he was a more hardline sort of person, at least rhetorically. He was very anti-US as well as being anti-Soviet. And he made a lot of enemies among the Mujahideen as well, because even before he got so much Pakistani support, because his group was one of the only Afghan insurgent groups that was actually like a party per se, like a functioning party. It was very strongly centralized. They reported everything to him to an extent that other Afghan groups didn't do to their parties. So the other party leaders disliked him because he was a competitor, and the other parties' commanders disliked him because there's this guy sitting in Peshawar who's making his fighters interfere with us or with our operations.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic with the various militias and their connections to different political parties in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and how those represent the interests of like landlords and things like that. I think you see a lot of this kind of breakdown along the lines of urban versus rural and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So they were probably, I guess, in total there were about a dozen different official parties between Pakistan and Iran. Iran, because it was fighting against Iraq, it couldn't give the same level of support that Pakistan could. But a lot of, especially the Shia groups, they were in Iran. But there were a lot of unrecognized groups too. But from the main recognized parties, Hikmatyar's party was was one of the only ones that functioned as a party. There was another party which was Burhanuddin Rabbani's party, which is the one that Ahmad Shah Massoud and a lot of other famous commanders belonged to. This party was more hands-off in its, in the way it dealt with its commanders. So its commanders generally tended to operate autonomously. And then a lot of other parties, they either didn't receive enough funds, so they lost their fighters who switched their allegiance to another party. And in most cases, the party that was in Peshawar, it didn't make much difference to the fighters in Afghanistan, because it was mainly a source of funds. And in most cases, they were not compelled to obey whatever the party leaders said. So there was a lot of fragmentation both between the parties and their commanders on the ground. So all of this, it sort of contributed to the fragmentation. And then the other factor was the foundation of militias, basically by the government. And a lot of those militias were basically mercenaries. So you get a complete brew of different groups that are very hard to organize. And Pakistan generally had more control over a lot of groups than most places, but Pakistan didn't have much control either. And the United States definitely didn't have any control over them of the sort that it did with the Contras. Because with the Contras were almost next door to the US. From what I understand, I've read a bit about them. Their operations and their funds and everything were directly supervised by the CIA. a lot of their leaders and commanders and stuff, they actually lived in the US, and they directed operations and stuff
Yeah, School of
from there.
Americas and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So the CIA's relationship to the Contras is much different from their relationship to the Mujahideen. And then the other factor is that although the Mujahideen, they had their share of atrocities or whatever, there was with the Contras, from what I understand, generally the Contras had a lot of death squad sort of behavior, and basically almost like terrorism sort of stuff, terrorizing the Sandinista government in Nicaragua rather than fighting an actual war. That was generally not the case with the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen definitely, and even if you talk to a lot of Afghans who are otherwise very divided in their opinions or whatever, some of them might be hostile to Pakistan, some of them might be hostile to the Taliban, some of them might be pro-Taliban, whatever. There's very few people who are going to have a good thing to say about the Soviet invasion, because it really was very, or even more than the Soviet invasion, the government that they had set up, because it was a very oppressive government to the extent that Afghanistan has not had before or since then.
Yeah, I always think of that government as being very similar to the Shah government that was in Iran in a lot of ways. Like ideologically, it was somewhat similar in the sense that it was kind of like a top-down authoritarian secularist sort of thing.
Yeah, the Shah was very anti-communist, but yeah, apart from
yes, that's true, but just
but in the sense of top-down,
top-down, secret police,
yeah, exactly.
a lot of torture and kind of like intimidation, like a mafia style.
Yeah, exactly. And then the thing is that in the 1990s, when the Civil War happened, a lot of people tended to they say like I remember reading a paper that said the Mujahideen proved the Soviets right when they started fighting amongst themselves, or committing atrocities or whatever. But if you look at a lot of the biggest abusers or like human rights violators of the 1990s war, a lot of those militias were the ones that had been set up by the communists, and they were not Mujahideen, except in the sense that they occasionally allied with one Mujahideen faction against another. And again, Dostum's militia is a pretty good example of this one. They were notorious for like all sorts of stuff, but rape and robbery and things like that.
I think they found some mass graves that were allegedly his responsibility. I forget what the numbers were. 3,000.
Well, in 1997, I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but there's several different like episodes. So yeah, there were cases like I'm sure the number runs into the thousands definitely.
Yeah. All right. I do want to get to these questions. We have quite a bit. Is there anything that you wanted to say before we do that, Donald? Anything you?
I just had one little question to sort of add into that mix that you discussed a little bit about China's involvement. Just briefly about and I guess it's in terms of selling weapons to Pakistan that then went to Afghanistan. I think that's what happened in.
Yeah, that was mainly.
And so how has that changed? Like, is China? I know China has sort of ramped up its involvement in other Central Asian sort of countries, and obviously it has its own problems in Western China. Is there a changing role for China in Afghanistan? Like, have they, they're sort of on this offensive around Central Asia, trying to, in terms of infrastructure and lending and things like that. Have they gotten more involved in Afghanistan itself, or is it not on their radar as much?
It's definitely on their radar. The thing is that China in Afghanistan, it has generally, sort of similar to India, it has generally worked through its allies. In the 1980s, like you mentioned, they supplied the Mujahideen mostly via Pakistan. In the 1990s, actually, because, like I said, that time Central Asia was sort of a free-for-all. So at that time, actually, China was very, very concerned about losing its, Western area, which was basically a recently conquered, mostly Turkic or whatever region.
Mm-hmm.
That had been conquered, I think, in the 1940s. So they were kind of nervous about that, because a lot of these groups, it was concerned that they would try to, attack this region as well, or, they would spread their influence and undermine this region. And there were a lot of Uyghurs from this region as well who were living in Pakistan, for example. So in the 1990s, China had a few crackdowns against generally peaceful or civil sort of opposition in that region. But they started to put a lot of pressure on Pakistan to basically to monitor or to deport the Uyghurs, and this was something that Pakistan didn't really start doing to a great extent until after 2001. But they did, for example, deport a few Uyghurs even as early as like the late 90s. How this is relevant to Afghanistan is that China, first of all, it has the interest that you mentioned in Central Asia. Secondly, they were worried that the Taliban was gonna, influence insurgencies, or the pre-Taliban Mujahideen for that matter. They were going to influence these sorts of insurgent groups among the Uyghurs. But generally speaking, China's role in the 1990s was more hands-off. They, when it came to Central Asia, they tried to negotiate with different people. They negotiated with the Taliban, and the Taliban said the same thing to them, which they said to other people, which was that they wouldn't let the Afghanistan be used to destabilize other countries. The thing is that the Uyghurs, there was never an actual war in that region since like the 1940s. So what China considers terrorism and stuff, it's like someone maybe taking a knife and stabbing a few people or things like that, and then they kind of because they're very concerned about security, they kind of crack down on that and sort of make sweeping policy changes based off that. But at that time, it wasn't such a big concern because their control in that region wasn't really challenged by any militant group. So they could tell the Taliban that we know that you have these guys in Afghanistan. But the group that was in Afghanistan, it was it was a handful of militants who were basically training. They didn't actually fight in China. They didn't really threaten China in any meaningful way. After 2001, China took this as an opportunity to impose the war on terrorism sort of model onto the same Uyghur region. And during Mao's period and even in the 1980s, they had already been very harsh and kind of in the typical totalitarian way, very like kind of a police state in that region. But in the 80s, partly because of the influence of Pakistan and partly because of the Chinese ruler at the time, Deng, whatever his name is, they were not as repressive at that time. And like for example, in the 80s, they started permitting Uyghurs to go on Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. After 2001, they slowly started to bring back the old measures and expand on them. And then under this new the guy who's in power now, Jinping, they have basically set up a very technologically advanced sort of police state. So they do have an interest in Afghanistan, technically speaking, from the security point of view. But my opinion is that this is more or less a pretext, basically, because even the most militant sort of Uyghur groups have never really actually militarily threatened China to any extent. I think the strategic and the trade aspect is much more important, and they have been competing with the U.S. for clients and stuff in Afghanistan, which Russia has also been doing, because a lot of the people that the U.S. now supports are the ones who Russia supported in the 1990s. So there is this sort of competition going on, but because of China's links to Pakistan, and Pakistan basically assuring them that they can guarantee the Taliban, that China is much less concerned about the Taliban than they would be about a lot of similar groups. And at least to the extent that the Taliban hurt the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, they're fine with it. At the same time, they're not supportive of the Taliban, and I'm sure they don't want to see it in power.
Mm-hmm.
I think they just want to have a finger in as many pies as they can. And from the security point of view, they just want to make sure that nothing from Afghanistan enters, the Uyghur region. But actually, most Uyghur fighters are nowadays they're in Syria. So there's not many in Afghanistan. There's a few in central Afghanistan and in northern central Afghanistan, the Turkic speaking parts. But they're generally pretty disciplined, and they're not Al Qaeda sorts of people who go around launching random attacks here and
Sure.
there. I don't know if China knows that or not, or if China cares about that. But the security aspect is not such a big concern for them.
Yeah, that might explain their presence in Syria. They have a little bit of a presence there, and they might be wanting
Yeah,
to gain some experience against those Uyghur troops and the other Central Asian troops that are
yeah,
there fighting against the Syrian government, and
yeah,
just to be able to bring that back home. I
yeah.
just for my part, I don't have any specific like evidence for this or anything, but it's just my feeling that they probably also are interested in Afghanistan just because of the fact that Russia, just as a measure against Russia, a measure against India,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
and also the fact that it's between them and Iran, and that's
Hmm.
important for energy logistics and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So it's just another case of Afghanistan being right, right there in that
yeah,
strategic
yeah.
area that it just becomes important because of where it is.
Right, exactly. And in this sense, it's China and India are sort of similar in the sense that unlike the US and Russia, they didn't put their troops into Afghanistan, but they have been working sort of by proxy, or like they're friends of whatever Afghan faction,
Right.
and they've been kind of like balancing that out.
All right. So we've been going about an hour and we have a bunch of questions. So we'll start off with the questions from our Patreon subscribers. The first one is it reads, how relevant are Pashtun clan politics at the present time compared to, say, the 1980s? How have contemporary patronage networks arising from the present conflict economy changed things?
Okay, this is actually a very good question. And it'll take a while to answer. So, in the 1980s, just before the 1980s, when the Khalqis were in power in Afghanistan, and like I mentioned before, these were generally Eastern Pashtuns. They launched a bunch of military campaigns in the east, generally very brutal. And a lot of the tribal leadership in this area, which is kind of like a stronghold of, Pashtun tribes, the east and the southeast, a lot of them fled abroad. So to that extent, it hit the tribal structure quite badly. But a lot of those leaders then, they returned, via the Mujahideen or via politics and were participating in the insurgency. Some of them, especially during from the mid 80s onwards, they were actually hired by the Afghan government, not necessarily because they were communists or pro-communist, but because they had, tribal enemies among the Mujahideen, or they had tribal competitors among the Mujahideen, or because, the government was just offering them arms and money. And Najibullah, he was actually from the Parcham party, which is generally not considered particularly pro-Pashtun, but he himself was a Pashtun, and he was also one of those Machiavellian sort of characters. So he was very well versed in like a lot of tribal politics and stuff like that. So he played a big role in this. He actually even influenced a few Pashtun tribes in Pakistan to basically, to attack like Mujahideen convoys and stuff like that. So they were definitely relevant in the 1980s, at least in eastern Afghanistan and to some extent in southern Afghanistan. They were relevant for both sides, for the pro-communist and for the pro-Mujahideen sides. But they were definitely weaker than they had been, for example, before the communists had come to power. In the 2010s or 2000s and 2010s, they're still relevant in some parts of Afghanistan. I think that their influence has it basically, the decades of war kind of undermined their influence inside a lot of like much of Afghanistan, outside apart from the very eastern part of Afghanistan where they still have a pretty strong influence. So, for example, the Daesh front over there, it's largely comprised of members of a couple of tribes that are fighting Taliban or, like independent sorts of groups from other tribes. It's still relevant there. The patronage thing is actually an interesting point because patronage, again, in the 1980s and in the 2000s, played a role in the sense that, like I said, a lot of the tribal leaders, they fled abroad. A lot of the structure was kind of, it went into upheaval. So, on one hand, you have the vacuum filled by groups like the Taliban or, things like that. On the other hand, you have it filled by commanders who were not senior members of the tribe, but because the senior members have left, these guys, they kind of stake a name for themselves. They got weapons and they got arms. And again, this was on both the government and the anti-government side in the 1980s. It also happened in the 2000s. And actually, in the 2000s, to an extent, you can say it happened more because in the 2000s, when the Taliban were ousted, at that time, because the Taliban were mostly Pashtuns, the United States and a lot of its allies, they were under the impression that they had to create a Pashtun alternative to the Taliban. So they looked at it from a very ethnic point of view, and this is also something that a lot of countries like Iran and Pakistan do when they look at Afghanistan. They look at it from a very ethnocentric point of view, which is not always helpful. But anyway, So, for example, Hamid Karzai and now Ashraf Ghani, who are not powerful figures themselves, they were basically set up to be Pashtun figureheads because most of the Afghan military groups who had fought the Taliban were not Pashtuns. Now, because Karzai and Ghani couldn't really rely on a lot of these non-Pashtun militias, they started setting up militias themselves from among their family or among their tribe or among families and tribes of groups that were threatened by the Taliban. So there was a lot of patronage that was given to Pashtun tribes that could fight against the Taliban. One example of this, which is it's a particularly unpleasant example, but it's a very revealing one, I think, is the Achakzai tribe, which is in the area of Kandahar, and it also spills over into Pakistan. In the 1980s, the main commander from this tribe was a guy called Ismatullah Muslim, who was a very, very typical sort of mercenary kind of commander. He was very, very openly brutal and ruthless, and there were a lot of stories about his atrocities and stuff. But at the same time, like often happens with these sorts of people, he was very popular with his fighters. So he had been an army officer. So he went to Pakistan. He said, I have experience or whatever. Give me money and give me weapons. So Pakistan did arm him. They told him to join one of the Mujahideen groups first. So he formally did, but he was basically independent. He was with them for a while. Then he switched sides, and he became the government's main commander in Kandahar. He was involved in a lot of the fighting in Kandahar during the late 1980s, and he was so powerful actually that there's stories of him like beating up like a government official or whatever, things like that. He actually fought against one of his old Mujahideen, a group from the same party when he had been with the Mujahideen, but it was from a different clan, the Barakzai clan, and he fought a lot against them, and I think thousands of people were killed in the fighting between these two. And Ismatullah Muslim, he died in the early 90s. His nephew Mansoor took over this group, and he kind of reconciled with that Barakzai group. And in the early 90s, both of them were very influential in Kandahar, and both of them were ousted from Kandahar by the Taliban. And in fact, Mansoor, who was the leader of this Achakzai militia, he was hanged from a tank by the Taliban when they captured the city. And now this guy, his nephew Abdul Razik, I guess he was just out of his teens at the time. He was hired by the US when they invaded in 2001, and he had the same sort of very ruthless, very sort of bloodthirsty sort of, but charismatic sort of reputation. His forces are known for like a lot of like rapes and stuff like that. And this sort of stuff is generally, obviously, it's like a big taboo in Pashtun culture and generally in most cultures and in tribal cultures especially. But because the tribal system had been hit badly, and the tribes had they were left with these sorts of people to lead them. So he was actually the main commander for the pro-government side in southern Afghanistan until he was murdered by the Taliban in 2018 in a suicide attack. And a lot of people joined the Taliban because he had been attacking their tribe. So the area that he ruled, which is right on the border with Pakistan, that area had another tribe called the Nurzai tribe. And a lot of Nurzai members joined the Taliban, especially early on. A lot of Taliban members were from the Nurzais because his Achakzai clan had been attacking them very, very much, for the first 4 or 5 years after the fall of the Taliban. So with this you can kind of see that the tribal structure kind of got hit. Patronage kind of replaced it in the sense that patronage was given to a charismatic or effective commander, and this is the case in some parts of Afghanistan, especially in southern Afghanistan. In eastern Afghanistan, which is like more like highland sort of area, the tribes are generally relatively strong, but it's definitely the case in a lot of southern Afghanistan. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. All right, so we got another question here. How reliable is the book Afghanistan: The Bear Trap by the Pakistani Brigadier General Mohammad Yusuf? Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, yes, I am. So he was one of the main ISI officials who was dealing with the Mujahideen in the 80s, and he actually mentions this guy Ismatullah Muslim in his book, and like with a lot of contempt. But anyway,
Hmm.
this is generally it's a pretty reliable book. To some extent, which a lot of non-Afghans did at the time, it kind of relies on a few stereotypes, good and bad, about Afghans. In Pakistan, definitely, especially at that time when like the Mujahideen were seen as holy warriors and stuff like that. There was like a lot of Pakistanis were like kind of in awe of them. Like the warrior Afghan. You train him once, and he goes out and wipes out a battalion or whatever. Like you hear all sorts of these stories, and now you've those stories actually in the 90s they got transferred from the earlier Mujahideen, and they got transferred to the Taliban. So there's a lot of like Taliban admirers as well in the army, even like up to the present day. I know a few of them, or I know of a few of them. I'm like I have mutual acquaintances with them. So in that sense, the book, like, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, in the sense that, um, for example, if you're an Afghan or something, and you see this guy having this stereotype of you as almost as a noble savage sort of thing, um, you know that is probably going to be irritating. But in terms of most of, like, the events and stuff, in those terms, it's a pretty good book.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
One more from the same questioner. Of the foreign powers that have occupied Afghanistan, which one had the fewest speakers of Afghan languages in its ranks? That's a pretty interesting idea. My
um,
my guess would be the United States, or perhaps the Soviets, maybe.
I would tend to think the United States, just because the Soviets had a lot of like, most of the officers were from other parts of the Soviet Union, but they did have quite a few Central Asians who would definitely speak, like, at least, like, like
Yeah.
the same language as Afghan, Uzbeks, or Tajiks, maybe Pashto as well.
Hmm.
But my guess would definitely be the United States. Britain didn't stay in Afghanistan for long, but the British Empire was, it was that sort of Machiavellian empire where they tended to learn everything about
Right. Yeah.
everyone before they before they attacked them, even if it was like kind of like colonial stereotypes or whatever. But they didn't study the people that they came into contact with. So I would guess the
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah, that would be my guess too, I guess. Okay, here's kind of a more lighter question. For the Afghanistan episode, Bachabazi, is it really that prevalent over there? Are there any groups that are against it, or what? So I don't know how much
Um,
you know about this, but
yeah. So it's obviously like in most places, like bachabazi, which is like basically pedophilia with like younger boys. Um, it happens in parts of Afghanistan. It's a taboo. It's a taboo, basically. But in some parts of Afghanistan, it's uh, it's basically become very normalized, or it's become like kind of almost like a subculture. I remember reading this British soldier's book. I forgot what it's called again. I always forget the names of books. But he was basically talking about how some Afghan soldiers who he was with in southern Afghanistan during the 2000s, they were looking at his young blonde soldier, like, very, very lustfully, and like, he said I don't think any of them would identify as gay or whatever, but this was, considered like a sort of like a tantalizing sort of taboo or whatever. But I overall, I think it is very much exaggerated, like a lot of these things tend to be. A lot of stereotypes tend to be very exaggerated. It's definitely considered a taboo, at least, like, in most of Afghanistan. But in some areas it's a subculture. I've often heard, I'm not sure if this is a factor, but I think it probably would be. I've often heard of so and so, recently promoted, or recently advancing commander, like, who got a lot of wealth or whatever, who would, take boys basically as his lovers or whatever, or sex slaves or whatever, sort of like as a status symbol, basically to show that, I can do anything. But it is a taboo, and I think it is very much exaggerated. It's like, one of those sorts of things that people, kind of get grossed out or they laugh about it or whatever when they hear about it,
Yeah.
and then they start seeing it in everything. But it's definitely not it's definitely not something that is looked at favorably, or like, oh, this is just a part of our culture. When and where it happens, it is more of a subculture, and like like sort of like the nod and wink sort of thing. Groups against this, officially, I'm pretty sure most groups, whether they were mujahideen or communist or whatever, would be against it. Unofficially, there have been a lot of stories of militias in like the ones that I mentioned, these sort of newer militias that were founded by like newfound commanders who were not tribal elders or whatever. So these guys were kind of like like roughshod sort of commander or whatever, who came up by themselves through fighting or whatever, and have money and patronage and all that as well. So there have been a lot of stories of those sorts of guys having involved in this. A lot of these groups, were very disproportionately represented in Dostum's group, which is basically a collection of militias in northern Afghanistan. And there's quite a few stories about that. There's a few stories about a few groups in southern Afghanistan engaging in this. And actually, one of the I think whoever asked this probably has heard the story of one of the reasons that the Taliban mobilized was because some boys or something had been raped by some militia, and basically to cut down on that or crack down on that. The Taliban have they've generally, because by the same token, they've generally been very harsh against this. But I did once hear of one of their commanders who was in charge of like border security or something on one of the borders, who was alleged to have done this in Pakistan during the 1990s, and he was expelled from the group, and he escaped abroad somewhere, but I don't think he was exactly punished because they didn't catch him. But they are generally very hard on this, and I think most of the more ideological sorts of groups are generally against it, especially those groups that are close to like a lot of the early Mujahideen groups were close to like the Ikhwani or Muslim Brotherhood type of ideology, and they used to, at least in their literature, they used to condemn this sort of behavior a lot. I've also heard of some old communist soldiers who are now who had lost a lot of influence, but they tended to frown on this behavior too, just because communism, whatever else its flaws, it doesn't approve of this behavior, even if a lot of its militia commanders in Afghanistan engaged in it. But I'm sure that a few communist like ideologues or whatever would be against it, but they're not a very numerous group.
Okay. So the next question here is, what are good English language news sources on AFPAC?
Oh, okay. So this includes Pakistan as well, which I haven't talked about that much. But
Yeah.
So on Afghanistan, there's a website called AfghanistanAnalysts.com, which is a very first-rate website. It has a lot of different like people who have studied in the field, and people from Afghanistan, people who have lived there or worked there or whatever. It is a very good website. So that would definitely be the number one website. Apart from that, I can't exactly think of a website per se. I can think of a few very good reporters, for example, or things like that, but or a few good analysts.
Well, who comes to mind? Maybe somebody to follow on Twitter or something like that. Besides yourself, of course.
Well, most of these people are much more qualified or whatever. But there's a guy called Burhan Osman, Borhan, and then his surname is Osman. He is he has generally studied the Afghan insurgency very, like the Taliban basically, very deeply, and he's now with the International Crisis Group. I think he used to be on this website that I mentioned. He is very good. There is I don't think he has a Twitter, but there's an Italian guy called Antonio Giostozzi. His last
I like
name
him a
is,
lot. Yeah, he's
yeah,
good.
yeah. So actually, I've heard some criticism about him from other people recently. Basically, because a lot of his recent books have been like based on anonymous interviews. So they make
Mm.
a lot of kind of sweeping claims. And one of them, which he wrote about Daesh in 2018, it was sort of a sensationalist book because he relied on interviews with basically with anonymous officials and with anonymous Daesh foot soldiers, and both of them had an interest in playing up Daesh's capabilities. So that
Yeah.
book was criticized a lot, but most of the other stuff that he's done, I have found it really, really helpful. Uh, Especially a book that he wrote called Empires of Mud.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, have you read that book?
Yes, I've read some of his
Yeah,
earlier stuff. I haven't really been keeping up with his more recent things, but he's
yeah, yeah.
very
So
good at providing like a kind of broad view of like the system of
yeah,
power and everything. Yeah.
yeah, it's very good. And he recently wrote a book called The Taliban at War, which is basically about their structure and stuff during the insurgency. And I actually only got hold of this like a couple of weeks ago, and it's a very good book. So I don't think he's on Twitter, or he might be, but if he is, I haven't seen him.
I
He's a
haven't
good
either.
source.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of good Afghan sorts of journalists, like this Burhan Osman guy. He's Afghan. There's a guy called Obaid Ali, Obaid, and Ali Lai, his last name. He does a lot of like field research in northern Afghanistan and western Afghanistan, which is a region that is very, very rarely like studied because it's close to Iran, and Iran, for obviously reasons, you can't really get to it as easily as you can to other parts of Afghanistan. But he does a lot of really like groundbreaking sort of work there. There's a few like Afghan like journalists and like even like activist type of people who I would like recommend you follow. So there is a group called Document Afghanistan, I think, and it's founded by Harun Arsalai. His last name is spelled Arsalai. He is actually, I believe, the family member of one of the very prominent Mujahideen leaders. But he has very good like balanced and like historical takes on Afghanistan. He's also sort of an activist sort of person. I think he's kind of close to like a lot of left uh, sort of like leftist activist groups in the U.S. But he has a lot of good research. He actually did some research on like an extrajudicial murder in Afghanistan last summer, which got the spy chief at the time fired. So which is sort of unprecedented. So he's very good. There's a friend of mine. I'm not sure if he wants to be named, but he recently founded, like I think a couple of days ago actually, a site called Afghan Eye. I think they only have like one article or maybe a couple more at the moment, but I would definitely follow him. And who else is there? There's a few like there's a few very good reporters. There's a guy called Graham Smith who I think you've probably heard of. He's done journalism and stuff for the Globe and Mail. Who else is there? Oh, this is not an individual. Like this is not. Oh, there's a guy called Anand Gopal. Anandgopal. He has done a lot of very good research. And I think he has done some work on Syria as well. Um, there's a really good book by this guy, and I'm not sure if he's written other books on Afghanistan, but he's written probably the single best book on Afghanistan. His name is Gilles Dorensoro. So his last name is Doronsoro, and I think he's French. And he wrote a book in 2005, so it's now kind of old, but it is definitely the single best book on Afghanistan up to that point that I've read. So I
Wow.
would recommend like reading some of these books and for English language sources. And my problem is that I often forget the names of books, so I can't think of others like offhand right now. But yeah, I think this
There's
is a good
one that
start.
comes to mind for me. It was written by he may be French or British or Canadian or American or something. He's a Westerner. His name's Edward Girardet.
Oh yeah, he wrote one in like the early 80s, I believe.
Yeah, Killing the
Um,
Brains, I think it's called.
yeah,
I found that
th-
very interesting. He was
yeah,
in
that's
Afghanistan for like 25 years and wrote about his experiences.
yeah. I've read something else that he wrote, and I don't remember the name of that book. Um, the book that I read, and I don't know about the Killing Cranes one, but the book that I read, it was, and I'm saying this as someone who was sympathetic to the Mujahideen, but it was partly propagandistic in the sense that it kind of showed it as a very gleaming holier than thou sort of war against
Oh, really?
evil. The one that I'm talking about, but I
Yeah.
might be
I didn't get the
there,
impression from the book I read, but I think he does have a lot of sympathies for just the people in the country.
yeah.
So he probably is like overly generous to maybe some of the fighting groups.
Yeah, he was actually I don't know if the term is embedded, but he definitely covered the Mujahideen commander Abdul Haq Arsala, whose
Mhm.
relative I spoke about earlier, who was founded the Document Afghanistan Group. So that was a very interesting front, and actually that commander's nephew, I think, is sort of an independent commander nowadays. He used to fight against the Taliban, and now he's fighting with them against Daesh. So they're an interesting family, and I think the brother of this commander that I mentioned, he's also involved in like talks and stuff with the Taliban, like independently of the government. So yeah, they're an interesting bunch. But I've kind of gone off track now. But yeah, so the writers in the books that I mentioned before, I think that would be a good start, and then probably like you could see you could move on from there. There's some people who I would like very strongly recommend not to follow just because a lot of their stuff is basically propaganda for one side or another. You can contact me privately. I don't think I should like mention them publicly. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I
So
mean,
if
but
anyone's curious,
that's
they can contact me privately.
yeah, I mean that's important too, right? To avoid misinformation as much as getting
Yeah,
accurate
yeah,
information.
yeah.
So a lot of the questions actually, when now that I'm looking at them, are sort of about the possibility of a peace treaty, and is it possible for if the United States leaves for Afghanistan to maintain a nation state, or is a imperial state or something along
Hmm.
those lines preferable, or what are the prospects for the future of Afghanistan? A U.S. withdrawal possibly happening within the next couple of years. What do you think?
Yeah. So I think this sort of touches on what I said earlier, but I think there's a lot of like complicating factors that would that would undermine the chance of a peace, whether between the Afghan government and the Taliban or between different groups in both of those. I did mention that the Taliban are generally more cohesive and disciplined or whatever, united. But I'm not sure what their that's on the question of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, which they basically unanimously oppose. On the question of sharing power with the government or what or what level of concessions or whatever they should make with the government, or if they should just attack the government outright. I'm not. I think that is potentially a much more divisive question. And then, like I mentioned, the government itself is very much divided between these different groups. So there's a lot of talk about like inter-Afghan peace, which is it. Yeah, sorry, just a minute. Yeah, yeah. So sorry, that was my nephew. So
That's all right.
there's a lot of talk about different like the different Afghans coming together, but I'm not sure that it's gonna be that simple. Even though like the sentiment is nice and one can try to be very optimistic, but I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this decade, in fact, if not in like in fact, if not in like legally, Afghanistan is basically partitioned in a way that's similar to Syria. But I do think that that would probably be the case even if the US, like, I think it's sort of the case even now, in the sense that there's big regions of Afghanistan that are basically ruled by different authorities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see. We'll kind of wrap it up here. Let me get one more question. Okay. How about this one? This is kind of a silly little question here. How did they get the goats so big in Pakistan? How big do you think they would get if you put them on steroids like with cows?
I have no idea.
Do you know what he's talking about?
I
with the
think he's
goats?
talking about the mountain goats, but I'm not.
Yeah.
But
I have a
no
feeling
idea.
our friend Leo sent this one. He's always talking about those.
Yeah, I have no idea, but I think they're like mountain goats. If this is the mountain goats, then like generally a lot of mountain animals tend to be large. That's like my most informed take on the on this question. I'm sure that steroids would help enlarge them even further.
Yeah, I know there's some sort of special breeding that they do to get them to grow a certain way, and they just look very peculiar because of, they're grown for certain characteristics
Yeah,
and things like that. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah, I think that's been it's been very informative. It's really been a pleasure talking with you, Ibrahim. I'm glad you're able to
yeah.
come on and
No,
do
no,
this show with us.
thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I waffled on a bit at times, but yeah, it's a
No,
bad
I mean,
habit.
you are full of information about this stuff, so it's really great to pick your brain and just hear what you're thinking.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, guys. If you're interested in getting a second episode of You Can't Win every week, you can do that by subscribing to our Patreon, and you will also get access to our Discord, where you can submit questions and talk to us in our community. So we hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll catch you again next week.
Теплое место, но улицы ждут отпечатков наших ног. Звездная пыль на сапогах. Мягкое кресло, клетчатый плед, не нажатый вовремя курок. Солнечный день в ослепительных снах. Группа крови на рукаве, мой порядковый номер на рукаве. Пожелай мне удачи в бою, пожелай мне не остаться в этой траве, не остаться в этой траве. Пожелай мне удачи, пожелай мне удачи. Есть чем платить, но я не хочу победы любой ценой. Я никому не хочу ставить ногу на грудь. Я хотел бы остаться с тобой, просто остаться с тобой. Но высокая в небе звезда зовет меня в путь. Группа крови на рукаве, мой порядковый номер на рукаве. Пожелай мне удачи.